The marble lobby of the Bank of Dover was a theater of unspoken power. The air, cool and sanitized, carried the hushed rustle of expensive suits and the low murmur of high-stakes transactions. It was a place where status was a currency, and every gesture, from the clasp of a briefcase to the firmness of a handshake, was a performance. Into this meticulously choreographed world walked a man who seemed to have wandered in from another time, a ghost the world had forgotten. He was 76, his gray cap pulled low, his shoes scuffed like they'd walked 1,000 miles, and in his hand, clutched with the gentle firmness of calloused fingers, was a folded check. It was a small, unassuming piece of paper. No entourage, no fanfare. Just a man, standing quietly in the line of one of the city's most formidable financial institutions. The young banker behind the desk, Bryce McConnell, was the future of this world. He was all sharp lines and dismissive efficiency, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "You sure you're in the right place, sir?" he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too condescending for the marble walls to absorb without an echo of arrogance. The old man didn't flinch. He simply handed over the check, a single piece of paper worth $5 million, and explained his request. A series of wire transfers to various nonprofits, and a final payment for a veterans' housing project. Bryce took the check and laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was a dismissive, arrogant chuckle that bounced across the polished floor, a sound designed to humiliate. "This has to be a joke," he said, waving the paper like a discarded receipt. "Do you even know what a transaction this size means? We're talking compliance, verification, fraud prevention, sir." He then raised his voice further, as if addressing the entire room. "Someone call security. We've got another genius here with a fake check." Clients turned their heads. A few snickered. A few more whispered. One person, phone in hand, began recording. Bryce, enjoying his moment in the spotlight, continued his verbal assault. "Sir, this isn't some grocery store. This is a federal bank. Do you understand what you're handing me?" He was relishing the humiliation of a man who, in his mind, didn't belong. But the old man, Elijah Booker, didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm out. He simply said, with a quiet authority that cut through the noise, "Please call your branch manager. She'll know who I am." That sentence, delivered with an almost poetic calm, pushed Bryce over the edge. "Our manager doesn't have time for walk-ins with fantasy money," he scoffed. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he added, "If this check were real, I'd quit my job on the spot." The room fell silent. A moment later, the elevator dinged, and out stepped a woman in a navy blue blazer, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome of urgency. It was Mary Ann Doyle, the branch manager. Her eyes scanned the room, then locked onto Elijah Booker. Her face went pale. She sprinted toward him, a blur of professionalism and panic, ignoring the line, the customers, and the recording phones. What she did next silenced the entire building, not because of the check's value, but because everyone suddenly realized they had just laughed at the man who had once saved the very bank they now worked for. The manager reached him and, her voice breaking with a mixture of shock and regret, said, "Mr. Booker, I am so sorry. I didn't know you were coming in today." Bryce McConnell stared, the confusion on his face and unmasking. The old man he had just publicly shamed was being addressed with a reverence usually reserved for board members or federal officials. "Please come with me," Mary Ann continued, her hand gently on Elijah's arm. "We'll take care of everything immediately." But Elijah didn't move. He turned slowly to face the stunned lobby, looked at Bryce, and then at the phone still held midair. The silence was thick with discomfort. Finally he spoke, his voice low but clear. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about the way people like him are trained to see people like me." That one sentence landed heavy, not as anger, but as a revelation. It forced Bryce to step back, not physically, but mentally, because for the first time in his professional life, he had no idea who he was actually speaking to. Inside the VIP meeting room, Mary Ann poured Elijah a cup of black coffee. The mood was different, softer. "Mary Ann," he said, settling into a leather chair, "how long has it been?" "Almost 16 years, she replied, nervously tucking her hair behind her ear. Back then, I was just your intern. You showed me how to build the rescue model that saved this bank after crash. Elijah nodded. And now, she hesitated. Now I'm the regional director. They shared a brief, knowing smile of mutual respect, but it faded quickly. I assume you saw what happened out there, Elijah said. Her expression turned dark. Yes, we'll deal with it. But Elijah raised a hand. Not just discipline. Bryce isn't the problem. He's a symptom. That phrase was a truth bomb. It wasn't about personal revenge. Elijah Booker was talking about the system, about how institutions often reward arrogance over discernment. Over the next 10 minutes, they reviewed the check. It was real. The funds were part of an investment trust Booker had established after the 2008 collapse. While most had walked away from the financial disaster, Elijah had stayed behind the scenes, rebuilding the bank's capital structure in exchange for preferred shares that had quietly matured into the multi-million-dollar payout he now carried. Marianne asked why he didn't send someone to handle the transfer. Elijah's reply was a masterclass in quiet principle. Because I want to see what your front line looks like now. It's easy to talk about equity and inclusion in the boardroom. I want to see if it lives in the lobby. Marianne looked away, knowing the answer was not good. Elijah pulled a folder from his bag, detailing the wire instructions for 3 community programs: a housing initiative for disabled veterans, a scholarship fund for underserved students, and a medical relief grant for Black families in rural counties. Mr. Booker, this is extraordinary, she said, her hands trembling as she read. It's overdue, he replied. She looked up at him, sipping his coffee with a serenity that could only be earned after decades of navigating rooms full of powerful people. You never wanted credit, did you? She asked almost to herself. Elijah smiled faintly. Credit doesn't build housing. It doesn't pay medical bills. And it sure doesn't undo the look on that young man's face when he thought I didn't belong. Meanwhile, in the lobby, the subtle chaos of the aftermath had begun. Bryce sat at his desk, no longer in control. Marianne had discreetly called in a senior compliance officer. The live stream clip had already hit social media, going viral under hashtags like #SilentPower and #he_saved_the_bank. This is why you treat everyone with respect. One comment read, that old man just schooled a whole generation. Bryce scrolled through the post with growing dread, but what shook him more was Elijah's voice in his head. Asterisk, it's not about me. It's about how you're trained to see me. Asterisk, that line stuck, challenging everything he thought he knew about professionalism. Inside the private room, Marianne asked if Elijah would allow a press release. Not yet, he said. Let the story walk on its own. People don't need to see my face. They need to examine their own. As he stood to leave, he tapped the folder on the table. Make sure every cent goes exactly where it's meant to. And if anyone gets in the way, call me. That last part was delivered with the gentle steel of someone who, while kind, had never forgotten how to pull strings. Before he left the room, he turned back. Oh, and tell your intern team to spend 1 day a week in the lobby. Let them see who's really walking in. Marianne, a lump in her throat, nodded. We will. By the time Elijah returned to the lobby, it had grown quiet. Bryce rose automatically, unsure whether to apologize or hide. Elijah didn't even look at him, not out of spite, but because the lesson had already been delivered. He walked past the front desk, out the glass doors and into the cool afternoon air, just an old man with quiet dignity, leaving behind a system that now had no choice but to look in the mirror. The fallout was swift. The regional compliance officer arrived within the hour. Bryce was escorted to a glass-walled office and asked to explain. He stammered about fraud protocols, but his own co-workers, who had witnessed the exchange, weren't willing to shield him, one admitted under her breath. He treats all the elderly clients that way, especially the ones who don't dress like tech brothers. The video's title alone hooked tens of thousands. Asterisk, he laughed at the old man's check. Then the bank froze. Asterisk on social media. The comments were relentless. Banks need to teach humility, not just compliance. Elijah Booker deserves a statue in that lobby. The media picked up the story. A retired economist and veteran investor snubbed by a young banker, then revealed to be the man who rebuilt the bank system. Elijah's name resurfaced. His 2009 white paper, Stability Without Greed, began trending again. But inside the bank, the real reckoning had begun. Bryce was offered a choice: a 6-month unpaid reassignment focused on community outreach and cultural bias training, or immediate resignation. He chose the former, not out of grace, but because he knew quitting would follow him. Mary Ann, however, saw it as the beginning of a culture shift she had long pushed for. She sent a branch-wide memo implementing a new policy she named the Booker Protocol. Every employee would spend 1 day per quarter in direct service with underserved communities. The goal wasn't charity, it was perspective. The next Monday, a framed copy of Elijah's original stock transfer document was hung quietly behind the service desk. The words at the bottom had been circled in red. All capital means nothing without human respect. Mary Ann then scheduled an emergency board meeting. She showed them the footage and its fallout. "This is not just a PR moment," she said. "This is a value reset. If our front desk can't reflect our mission, then our mission is just marketing." No one objected. Then, a few days later, a handwritten letter arrived at her office with no return address. It simply read, "Tell your team this. Kindness is cheaper than regret." Enclosed was an anonymous check for $2.5 million. Mary Ann knew exactly who sent it. So did Bryce. The story kept building. An investigative article in the Wall Street Ledger titled "The Man Who Rebuilt the Bank They Tried to Forget" drew millions of views. It detailed Elijah's involvement with over a dozen institutions after the crash and his quiet work behind the scenes, turning down a high-ranking position in the Obama administration to write fiscal strategies and fund grassroots programs. He was no longer just the old man with the check. He was a national conversation. Public pressure mounted. A former scholarship recipient from Elijah's foundation posted a heartfelt video. "I used to mop the floors of this bank. Now I own a fintech startup. The only reason I got to college was because of a man none of you ever saw on magazine covers. His name is Elijah Booker." The post exploded, pulling in comments from veterans, professors, and small business owners who had all benefited from Elijah's quiet trusts. Bryce McConnell was summoned for one final meeting, this time with the Diversity and Inclusion Council. They didn't scold him. They invited him to speak at a high school in the same underserved neighborhood where Elijah grew up. Bryce froze. "You want me to what?" The program coordinator, a calm woman named Denise, replied, "Talk about the mistake. Talk about what you learned. And don't sugarcoat it." Bryce, for the first time, felt truly exposed. He agreed. A week later, he stood in a public high school gym. No PowerPoint, no podium, just raw honesty. "I judged a man by his coat," he began. "I thought I was the future of finance. Turns out I didn't know my own history." The students listened. It was more powerful than any applause. When a young man asked, "Did you ever tell him you were sorry?" Bryce's face flushed. "No," he said, "but I will." And he meant it. Meanwhile, inside the bank, a young financial analyst named Lucas, working under Mary Ann, discovered something buried deep in the vault files. A document dated 15 years earlier, giving Elijah Booker preferred stakeholder authority and advisory access to key policy decisions. Elijah had never invoked it. Until now. The real twist wasn't his money, but his quiet power. He was the bank's single largest non-executive shareholder, controlling a block of stock that allowed him to challenge executive votes. Mary Ann, after learning this, picked up her phone, dialed Elijah directly, and said, "Sir, would you consider joining our quarterly oversight committee?" There was a long pause. "Only if the committee meets at the same table where you made that young man stand while being mocked." Elijah replied, "Humility isn't a department. It's a location." Bryce, in his own journey of redemption, went to the veterans' housing site that Elijah's funds had built. He met the superintendent. He helped paint a fence, not because he had to, but because he couldn't sit in comfort while others carried the weight of redemption for him. It wasn't dramatic or social media worthy. It was real. The bank drafted a formal press release. Elijah made the final edit. He crossed out Mr. Booker's generosity and replaced it with Mr. Booker's enduring belief that respect should never be performance-based. The release carried a conviction that corporate apologies lacked. Comments flooded in. The bank stock rose by 2.7% that week, not because of damage control, but because investors saw something rare: integrity. Elijah didn't sell his shares. He established a standing discretionary grant where dividends from his holdings would automatically fund education, housing, and medical aid in underserved zip codes every quarter. Quietly, indefinitely, the bank did something unheard of. It renamed its main lobby, not after a founder, not after a donor, but after a principal. The brass plaque near the entrance now reads, "The Elijah Booker Hall, where everyone deserves to be seen." 2 weeks later, at a private symposium in New York, the keynote speaker wasn't a billionaire or a Harvard professor. It was Elijah Booker. He walked onto the stage with a gray suit and a presence that commanded attention without asking for it. "We've trained a generation to chase numbers," he began. "But what happens when those numbers come wrapped in assumptions? When you value a client by their clothes, their age, their zip code, you don't just risk a mistake. You invite a collapse of trust." He paused, letting the silence teach more than the words. "I didn't come back to teach banking," he added. "I came back to remind you that the floor of every great institution is built on how it treats its quietest visitors." The speech went viral. Back in the corner of the crowd, Bryce McConnell sat quietly, taking notes, not on finance, but on decency. Elijah's legacy didn't stop there. He still lived in his quiet neighborhood, but people started stopping by, not for autographs, but just to sit and listen. One afternoon, a boy no older than 10 approached him with a composition notebook. "My mom said you built our school library," he said shyly. Elijah smiled. "What are you reading?" he asked. The boy said, "A book about civil rights." Elijah nodded. "Good. You're walking the same path I did, just a few steps ahead." Back at the bank, a new plaque appeared next to the teller windows. Small, unobtrusive, and powerful. It read, "Respect is not a service. It is a starting point." And then, the final twist. Marianne received a sealed letter marked "Private, Eyes Only." Inside, a note in Elijah's handwriting read, "Asterisk, you once said you wanted to change the system from within. Now you can. I've transferred my shares into a trust with you as executive. Use it to teach. Use it to protect. Use it to prove that the soul of the bank is not its balance sheet, but its backbone." Asterisk. With that one move, Elijah had made Marianne the guardian of more than stock. He had made her the guardian of a legacy. Thus ended the tale, not with applause, but with accountability. Not with revenge, but with renewal. The most powerful man in the room, it turned out, was the one who never needed to prove it. And as the institution moved forward, one truth rang louder than any slogan. The loudest changes sometimes begin with the quietest people. Elijah Booker never raised his voice. He never filed a lawsuit. He simply held up a mirror and let the system see itself. And when that reflection became too uncomfortable to ignore, it wasn't destruction he delivered. It was a second chance. For Bryce McConnell, that second chance wasn't comfortable, but it was transformative. In the months that followed, he didn't just complete his community service. One day, long after the media storm had faded, he knocked on a familiar door in a quiet neighborhood with nothing in his hand but a letter. Elijah opened it slowly. Bryce handed him the envelope. "I know I can't undo what I did," he said, "but I want you to know I finally understand why it mattered." Inside the letter was a personal scholarship Bryce had funded in Elijah's name. It wasn't for credit. It was for redemption. Elijah read it, nodded, and replied, "Then I believe you've made peace with the mirror." Marianne, the new steward of Elijah's trust, carried the weight not as a burden, but as a vow. Under her leadership, the bank became known for dignity-based banking. And for the customers who walked through those doors, something changed, too. No more assumptions. No more sideways glances. Just service, real, respectful, and human. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Elijah Booker isn't his shares, his speeches, or his scholarships. It's this simple truth. Power doesn't always look like a man in a suit shouting orders. Sometimes it looks like a man in a cap holding a check, refusing to be small, even when the world tries to make him invisible. Because history doesn't always come crashing through the front door. Sometimes it walks in quietly, then changes everything.